Hello, this presentation is one of a series relating to the Department for International Development's Aid for Trade programme and looks at the specific contribution that System Dynamics might make to the planning and management of a training assistance programme. Previous presentations have explained the background to the pilot project on System Dynamics in the Aid for Trade situation and outlined the principles of how the trade system actually operates. The second presentation showed how that understanding can be used to organise the portfolio of trade improvement efforts and provide a framework for planning, managing, monitoring and evaluating a whole programme of initiatives. And this presentation is the first of two, explaining how the same principles can be used for detailed planning and control. And we're going to look at the specific case of training customs officials. So the way this framework builds up is to start from thinking about the demand that the provision of trained officials is actually trying to fulfill. And that demand consists of the number of people per day attempting to cross the country's borders or cross through its ports or airports. So that's the demand that staffing needs to serve. And in total, that has got to deal with all of the exporting trips through all ports and borders in the country, as well as, of course, all importing activity that goes on. The capacity to fulfill that demand determines the maximum rate of border or port crossings that can actually be handled. And the provision of trained customs officials is just one of those capacities that needs to be in place. You also need actual border posts, you need actual buildings, equipment, and you need other kinds of officials as well. But we're looking specifically at making sure we've got enough trained customs officials. If you don't have enough to match that demand for people wishing to cross each day, then you end up with border delays, and we want to provide enough officials to avoid those delays arising at ports and borders. As I say, this is just one of the capacities that needs to be adequate. Now, I should just add at this point that there is already in place an aid-supported programme for the training of customs officials, and it's very likely that some planning of this sort is already in place. But what we're trying to do in this presentation is show the general principle of how this planning can be done so it can be generalised and replicated across all similar situations, both in Nigeria, where this pilot project is taking place, and in other countries where you're trying to support the same improvements. The first point to make is that if all you do is look at the border delays and then decide to hire and train officials, it will actually be too late. It takes quite a long time to hire and train people to the degree you need to be able to do a job such as this competently and reliably. So the likelihood is that delays will go on for many months after you spot that that's the issue you need to fix. So this linkage here, looking at the border delays and then deciding to hire customs officials, really won't do. You need a better approach than that. And that better approach means that you need to look at what is likely to happen in future months to the number of attempted crossings that traders will try to make. Now, the proper way to do that would be to estimate growth in the number of people in the country attempting to participate in export trade, the frequency with which they do so, and that would give you a forecast for the attempted rate of exporting trips that people want to make. But you don't have to forecast all of this. What you do need, though, is some estimate somehow of how that demand for crossing trips might actually grow. From that, you can work out how many border officials will be required at various points in the future. So you're looking over the hill, if you like, to the future need for officers. You're not looking at what that need is right now. You're anticipating what that need will be. And from that, you can estimate what the shortfall of trained officers is likely to be, and you pitch your hiring and training to fulfill that expected shortfall in the number of people you need. You must, though, also take account of the fact that there will be turnover amongst this staff group. People will leave for all kinds of different reasons. So in that planning for the numbers that you need to train, do remember to take account of that likely turnover. Now, there are three different levels at which you can implement this approach to planning and management of training. The first level, which is the simplest, is simply to do manual models of this, sketching estimated scale and time path of the inputs, outputs and outcomes, in this case, inputs being training activity, outputs being the number of trained officials you get, and outcomes being the rate of exporting trips that are taking place. When you do that, you will implicitly be estimating the interdependencies in this situation. So you will have a sense of how many people per day the average trained official can allow through different kinds of ports and borders. And then as you go forward, you plot actual results against plan manually each period and adapt the project and the spend and effort you put in the light of that progress. You can go to two further stages, though, which I'll explain shortly, which involve the use of software for doing the same planning and actually producing working software models to help still further in that planning. So doing this by hand is really very simple. You have a diagram such as this on the wall of your office or on a large sheet of paper, and you enter the actual numbers that you believe to be the case for each of these charts. And the charts fulfill a really useful purpose because they don't just tell you what the situation is, they tell you the rate at which it's changing and moving towards what you want it to be. But you do it with numbers. So for purely illustrative purposes, let's say we currently have 600 trained customs officials who between them can handle 30,000 people wanting to make export trips per day. And we estimate that there are 40,000 people trying to make such trips. So we are probably in a situation where there are actual border delays. What we do with the looking forward is we sketch what we anticipate the future might be. So we think that the numbers of people wanting to cross will grow to 200,000 per day over the next 3 years. And to get there, we're going to have to train people at the rate of 50 per month to allow for the growth that we need, plus expected turnover amongst those staff. What the red lines are doing is showing the time path of what has actually happened up to that point in time. So looking back from 3 years in the future, what we discover is that we can actually only handle 150,000 people trying to cross per day because we haven't got as many trained customs officials as we wanted to. And that means that the 200,000 people trying to cross per day isn't happening. It's only a lower number, 170,000, because there are border delays and people don't want to sit and wait at the borders. Now, of course, this can perfectly easily be done in a spreadsheet, but as I say, what this diagram does is it brings the whole picture to life and gives you a living understanding of how the situation is evolving. But if you did put these numbers into a spreadsheet, you might end up with this kind of table where each line shows how many training days you're putting in, how many trained officials you think there are, how they're allocated between land borders, the ports and the airports, and how many there are at each individual land crossing, each individual port, and so on. You simply run that forward over as many years into the future as you feel you need to do. Then you add columns for a comparison between what's actually happening and the plan that you have, and also include in your spreadsheet the indicators for the outcome that you're trying to generate, which in this case is the number of people crossing on export trips per day. Now, as I say, this is a simple, focused example specifically on the issue of training customs officials. But of course, you actually have to replicate this. You'd repeat the same exercise across all border types, so that's all the different land borders, all the ports and all the airports. And you adopt the same approach for all the different types of officials that you need to manage exporting activity, immigration and emigration, so health, security, food standards and so on. Exactly the same approach works for all of those kinds of training plans. And what we've actually done here is illustrated a completely generic planning and control model for any single issue. This one happens to be about training, but it could equally well be concerned with the construction of border posts or the provision of equipment or the reduction in the number of documents required for export trade to take place. And where you start is with a time chart for your desired outcome. and how you want to see that outcome change over time for the better. You set out the required growth in the resources necessary for that outcome to be achieved. You work out from that at what rate you have to change that resource to enable that outcome. And that has implications for how much money and effort you're going to put in to make that come about. What you then do is check the actual outcome against what you desire and revise the spend and effort for any gap that arises. So your implementation is a continuous process of revising spend and effort for the progress you're actually getting compared with what you wanted. There will always be other factors, of course, and you will need to adjust your assessment of the outcomes and progress in the light of other things that are going on. But as I say, this is a completely generic planning and control model, a version of which can be used for any particular initiative that you're pursuing. Now, I mentioned that there are 3 options for doing this, and I've just described how it can be done manually on paper, supported by standard spreadsheets. But actually, there's a much better way of doing this, which is to use software designed for this purpose. And you put the same numerical estimates for inputs, outputs, and outcomes into that software, do some simple calculations, and enter into that software how those results compare with the plan, and once again adapt the project and the spend and the effort in the light of progress. And finally, you can get the software model to work things out for you and to simulate how things are likely to play out into the future. Now, we have both the methodology and the technology these days for any such policy intervention to be tested with simulation. And because we can do that, and because it gives us much better management and control of any initiative that we're planning, we really should do this, because it substantially reduces the risk that we will get our planning wrong or fail to manage initiatives as well as we could do. So this is what such a model might look like. In this yellow section, we are showing not only the growth in the number of trained border officials that's happening, but we're also showing the stock of officials who are in training, and we're recognizing that officials will be lost not only after they're trained, but they will drop out from the training program too. What's shown in the blue lines on these diagrams is very much a base case in which very little progress is being made. We're training at a slow rate, the number of people in training isn't changing at all, and as a result, the number of trained border officials is actually growing very slowly indeed. So enter the likely decisions by hand, and the charts display actual or estimated data over the planning period. On the right-hand side of the diagram, we're showing how many people there are trying to cross the borders. We're showing how many border posts there are, and we're figuring out how many officials there are per border post that we're trying to staff. And you can see that that number's actually going down because we're increasing the number of border posts, but we're not increasing the number of officials sufficiently to man all of those posts. So the larger diagram at the bottom of the picture shows the growth in the number of board officials that we have and the number that's actually needed. And we're clearly, on this policy, way short of the number of people that we need. Once we've got that model, though, we can turn it into a fully functioning simulation and actually enter the data about what's happening as it goes. So on this diagram, the red lines are showing what's actually happening up to the point in time where those red lines stop. So each of those is a monthly time series into which we've actually entered data. This working model displays calculated outputs and compares it constantly with actual outputs as they happen. This is the demonstration model that shows how system dynamics can help with the planning for the hiring and training of officials for border crossings. It concerns just one category of officials but can be replicated for all other kinds of officials that might be necessary. The section on the left deals with the officials themselves, and the green section to the right shows the development of land border posts, the small traders who use those border posts, and the trading traffic that goes across the border posts. Simply hit reset, then play to run the model out over 5 years or 60 months. Playing it in that way simply replicates the base case assumptions that are in the model. You'll see that officials have been hired at a rather slow rate on the left, so there's been no change in the number of officials who are in the training process and only a rather slow growth in the number of border officials who are actually trained and deployed. That's because there is a turnover of trained officials who are lost, and some of the officials who are recruited for training drop out during the training process as well. This is the total of all this category of officials, and a percentage of those only are deployed at these small land border posts. Another group highlighted in blue are deployed at larger land border posts. Those are highways dealing with large numbers of trucks, and a further proportion of these officials in the purple area are deployed at ports and airports. So we're only concentrating on the number of officials and the trading activity that's going across small land border crossings. On the right, you'll see that there's been a steady increase in the number of land border posts that have to be manned, and every one of those posts that is added brings with it a number of additional traders using those posts. Not as many on average as use the existing border posts, which will tend to be in busier areas, but nevertheless it's an increase in the number of traders. There's also a further increase in the number of traders each year across all these small land border posts, so there's organic growth as well as growth from adding additional border posts. Further down in the green section you can see the number of crossing attempts per day that traders attempt to make at each border post on average, and the maximum number of crossings per day that can be handled given the number of officials who are deployed at those posts. The large chart towards the bottom shows that the growth in demand for trading traffic in the green line has grown really rather faster than the growth in the number of officials that we need to support that increase in demand. Hit reset once more, and we'll see how we can use some of the parameters in the panel at the left to test out alternative assumptions. So one thing we might look at is to see what would happen if we opened additional border posts rather more quickly. So instead of opening a border post every 6 months, we open a border post every 4 months. Play that through to month 24, and you can see that the number of officials that we have is just about matching the demand for trading traffic at these border posts. So it's probably a good idea if we increased our hiring rate. So instead of hiring 10 new officials per month, let's double that to 20 and step forward a further 3 months. Although we've got an increase in the number of officials in training, it actually takes some months for those people to complete that training. So we haven't got any increase as yet in the number of trained border officials who are available. We play on a further 12 months. We can see that that increase in border officials is now coming through, and the large chart towards the bottom shows that that's just about keeping pace with the growth in demand from the larger number of land border posts that we're trying to support and the organic growth of demand from traders going through those border posts. You can see also that there was a brief period where a small percentage of trips by small traders failed, but now we've got the staffing in place. All the crossing attempts that people want to make are getting through successfully. Play it through to the end, and once again we find that the growth in demand outstrips the capacity of our border officials to deal with all that demand at the crossing posts, and once again we have a significant percentage of trips by these traders that just can't get through. They end up sitting at the border waiting to get through, but the border officials simply can't cope with the demand. There are a number of other parameters we can explore. We can change the frequency with which people make trading trips, and we can also look at different assumptions about staff turnover and the allocation of staff between the different uses. If you wanted to widen this model to deal with all of the trading activities through large land borders, ports and airports as well, then you would simply replicate the structure that is shown in the green area. The other point to mention here is that the red lines in some of these charts show the default results from running the model with the base case assumptions, and the blue shows the result of your policy compared with that. There is another use for those red time series, which is that if you were using this model in reality for the management of the training program, you could actually put in real month-by-month data into those red time series and compare that actual data that's coming in with what the model is telling you should be happening. This presentation has explained a very simple approach to the detailed planning and control for a specific intervention in the case of training customs officials. The next presentation will show how the same approach can be used for a rather more complex situation, which is the planning and management of a set of initiatives to improve export trade across a single land border.